At the beginning of the 20th century, Spain was a nation that was trying to learn to walk again on a ground strewn with rubble and ashes. The trauma of '98 had not gone away with the signing of the treaties. It was still there, floating like a thick fog in the air of the cities and weighing on the sepulchral silence of the fields of Castile. Spain felt small, mutilated, a power that had been erased from the maps of world power with a single stroke of the pen. But after the humiliation, after the crying of the mothers in the ports and the return of the spectral soldiers, something unexpected happened, something that no one in the offices of Washington or Paris could foresee. By losing the last overseas jewels, the Spanish capital that for centuries had flowed to Cuba and the Philippines suddenly returned to the peninsula. The Indians, those men who had risked everything in the Caribbean and who were now returning with their savings or their rescued fortunes, brought their money back to the mother country. It was a massive and desperate return of capital that, paradoxically, became the fertile seed of true Spanish industrialization. The money that previously fed sugar plantations in the Antilles now began to feed banks, foundries and shipyards on Spanish soil. Spain could no longer look outward with imperial ambition. It no longer had an empire to plunder, nor distant lands to administer, nor colonies to exploit. For the first time in 400 long years, Spain was forced by fate to look at itself, at its own mountains, at its forgotten mines and its abandoned people. The era of regenerationism began, a movement that did not seek glory in war, but redemption in work. Joaquin Costa, the great prophet of this new era, shouted it with a contained rage at every rally and in every writing, school and pantry, and double key to the tomb of the Cid. It was a battle cry against crippling nostalgia. It was a direct order to bury the imperial past once and for all, to stop dreaming of armored conquerors, to start building a modern, productive, scientific and European nation. In the north, the landscape began to transform under the sign of steel. The chimneys of the Altos Hornos de Vizcaya began to darken the sky with thick smoke that, for many, was the aroma of progress. Basque iron, which for decades had been sent raw to the factories of England, was now beginning to stay at home to forge the foundations of its own national industry. The hydraulic hammers and the roar of the 1,000-degree furnaces created a symphony of power that Spain did not know. In Catalonia, the steam of textile machines and the hum of automatic looms wove a new social structure. An ambitious, cosmopolitan bourgeoisie was born that looked to Paris and London with the desire to compete. And along with them, in the textile factories of Barcelona, a conscious proletariat was also born, a working class that was beginning to understand that its strength was not in submission, but in union and in the fight for a dignified life. Spanish cities began to change their skin before the astonished eyes of a population that still lived in the 18th century. Electricity, that magical fluid that defied the night, began to illuminate the avenues of Madrid and Barcelona. The old gas street lamps, with their yellowish, flickering light, were replaced by bulbs with a cold, powerful white light that promised a future without shadows. Electric trams began to travel the streets with their characteristic jingle, displacing the horse-drawn carriages that had dominated transportation for centuries. The sound of hooves on the cobblestones was replaced, little by little, by the metallic roar of the first explosion engines, strange machines that spewed smoke and speed, forever changing the rhythm of human life. But this accelerated progress had a dark price, and Spain was paying for it with social tension that grew like a silent but unstoppable tide. As the big banks were founded and companies multiplied their profits, the gap between the worker who worked 14 or 16 hours a day in deplorable conditions, and the factory owner who lived in absolute luxury, became simply unbearable. The anarchist and socialist ideas, that came from a Europe in full ideological boiling, found extremely fertile ground in Spain. It was a field fertilized by centuries of injustice, of rural bossism and contempt for the lives of the poorest. Spain tried to be modern on the outside. It wanted to show off majestic buildings and fast trains, but on the inside it was still a pressure cooker ready to explode. The Restoration system, that same system of peaceful shifts and bought votes that had led us to the disaster of '98, tried to survive by changing names and faces, but the vices that corroded it were the same. The young King Alfonso Tracy, enthusiastic, sportsman and eager to reign, inherited in 1886 a throne that, although surrounded by protocol and velvet, trembled under his feet before every strike and every protest. It was the beginning of a century that promised to be one of light and discovery, but that was loaded with black clouds, dense and storm-laden on the near horizon. An era of iron, of technological hope and latent violence that would mark, with fire and blood, the destiny of all Spaniards during the following decades. Spain was being reborn, but the pain of childbirth was going to be much longer and crueler than anyone dared to imagine. But while the cities were illuminated with electricity, on the horizon of Africa a new tragedy was beginning to take shape that would devour the peace of Spain. After the loss of the empire in '98, the wounded pride of the Spanish military sought refuge in the arid lands of northern Morocco. It was not a war for resources, nor for actual expansion, it was a war for the honor of an army that needed to prove to itself that it was still capable of winning. However, Morocco would not be a military parade, it would become a swamp of blood and corruption that would end up sinking the monarchy. The Barranco del Lobo disaster occurred on July 27, 1909, leaving a trail of corpses and a question that ran through the entire peninsula: why should our children die in a land that does not belong to us? The conscription system was the maximum expression of social injustice. The children of the rich could pay a fee, the famous cash redemption, to avoid going to the front. Meanwhile, the children of the poor, the factory workers of Barcelona and the peasants of Andalusia, were sent to die in the hills of the Rif without adequate equipment, without training and under the command of generals more concerned with their medals than the lives of their men. The tension built up for years in the factories finally exploded in July 1909. Barcelona, the Rose of Fire, became a battlefield. What began as a general strike against the sending of reservists to Morocco became tragic week. The streets were filled with barricades, the smoke from the burning convents darkened the sky and the sound of rifles replaced that of textile machines. It was not just a protest against the war, it was the cry of a working class that was no longer willing to be cannon fodder for the elites. The repression was relentless. Mora's conservative government responded with a state of war, leaving behind hundreds of deaths and a hatred that would divide Spain into two irreconcilable sides. The execution of Francisco Ferrer y Guardia, a pedagogue and free-thinker unjustly accused of instigating the revolt, shocked Europe and left Spain isolated internationally. The cry of Mora no brought down the government, but the wound was already too deep to heal with a change of ministers. Spain was now a schizophrenic nation. On the one hand, the architects of modernism built impossible buildings like the Sagrada Familia or the Casa Mila, searching for beauty in the future. On the other hand, the reality of the trenches in Africa and the misery of the working-class suburbs reminded us that the country was on the brink of an abyss. The monarchy of Alfonso Tracy, trapped between the sword of the military and the wall of social protests, was beginning to lose its luster. The king, who loved the army above all else, did not understand that the world was changing. That the workers were no longer asking for charity, but for justice. That intellectuals were no longer asking for reforms, but for a revolution of consciences. Morocco was still there, like a festering wound, consuming the money that should have gone to schools and hospitals. Spain was trying to be a modern empire abroad, while at home it was crumbling under the weight of its own inequality. The perfect storm was forming, and the outbreak of the Great War in Europe in 1914 would test the fragility of this new Spanish awakening. In 1914, the world exploded into 1,000 pieces. The Great War, a conflict on a scale never seen before, turned Europe into a slaughterhouse of steel and mud. Spain, exhausted by its own internal struggles and with an army that was still licking Morocco's wounds, made a decision that would change its immediate destiny: neutrality. It was a neutrality born of weakness, but quickly transformed into a golden opportunity. Spain became, overnight, the great pantry and the great factory of a Europe that only knew how to destroy. Our borders were open to export everything that countries at war desperately needed. Coal from the mines of Asturias to move the British ships. Basque iron for the French cannons. Catalan textiles for the uniforms that would die in the trenches, and food from our fields to feed millions of men who could no longer cultivate their land. Spain then experienced a frenetic gold rush. Money was flowing like never before in the country's modern history. Fortunes were created in months. The ports were overwhelmed with ships loading merchandise at exorbitant prices. Madrid and Barcelona were filled with spies, with adventurers and businessmen who toasted with French champagne while the rest of the continent bled to death. But behind that shine of easy wealth, a terrible shadow was hidden that would end up suffocating the Spanish people. The massive export of products caused unprecedented internal shortages. While the owners of the factories and shipping companies accumulated gold bars in the banks, the price of bread, of oil and coal for Spanish homes skyrocketed to levels unattainable for the common citizen. It was the cruelest paradox in our history: Spain had never been so rich, and the Spanish had never been so hungry. Inflation devoured salaries, while corporate profits multiplied by 1,000. Social tension, which was already high, reached the boiling point. The worker looked with rage at the new palaces of the bourgeoisie, knowing that this luxury was being built with the hunger of his own children. And in the midst of this chaos of wealth and misery, Spanish politics ended up breaking down. In 1917, the Restoration system suffered its death blow with a triple crisis that put the monarchy on the ropes. First, the military defense boards. The army, divided between those fighting in Africa and those remaining on the peninsula, rebelled against the government demanding improvements in political power. After, the Assembly of Parliamentarians in Barcelona, an attempt by the Catalan bourgeoisie and leftist forces to break the centralism of Madrid and democratize the country. And finally, the Great Revolutionary General Strike. Spain stopped completely. The trains stopped honking, the chimneys stopped smoking, and the streets became, once again, battlefields between the unions and the army. The repression was bloody, but the message was clear: the old system of the peaceful shift was dead. He was no longer fit to govern a society that had been forcibly awakened in the heat of the Great War. As if that were not enough, at the end of the war, the Spanish flu arrived. A silent and deadly pandemic that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in Spain, sowing panic in a nation that could no longer take it anymore. Spain emerged from the First World War with its pockets full of gold, but with a broken soul, divided and on the brink of an internal civil war that no one knew how to stop. The 20th century had promised us progress, but it was giving us a labyrinth of hate and inequality from which it would be very difficult to escape. But the worst was yet to come. While Spain was lost in its internal fights for the gold of the Great War, in the arid and treacherous mountains of the Rif, in Morocco, the greatest tragedy in modern Spanish military history was unfolding. In the summer of 1921, General Silvestre, an impulsive man close to King Alfonso XIII, launched a reckless offensive towards the heart of the Rifian tribes led by Abd el-Krim. It was an act of blind pride. With no secure supply lines, no water, and an army of terrified recruits, Spanish troops entered a deadly mousetrap. What followed was the annual disaster. It wasn't a battle, it was carnage. Thousands of Spanish soldiers, abandoned by their officers in a chaotic flight, were massacred in the gorges. The cries of agony of almost 10,000 men were etched into the nation's conscience. All of Spain shook with rage and pain. How was it possible for a modern army to be wiped out by shepherd tribes? The subsequent investigation, the famous Picasso file, began to uncover a network of corruption, cowardice and incompetence that reached the highest offices in Madrid. The king himself was said to have encouraged Sylvester's recklessness. The monarchy was doomed. To prevent the truth from coming to light in Parliament, in September 1923, General Miguel Primo de Rivera carried out a coup d'état with the approval of the king. The constitution was suspended, parties were banned and Spain entered a 7-year dictatorship. It was a time of cemetery peace and great public works. Roads were built. Telefonica was founded and the great exhibitions of Seville and Barcelona were held in 1929. Spain wanted to look modern to the world, but under the concrete of the new dams and the asphalt of the roads, social resentment continued to boil. The dictatorship did not solve the problems, it only muzzled them. When the global economic crisis of 1929 hit Spain's borders, the system collapsed like a house of cards. Primo de Rivera resigned and went into exile, leaving the king alone before a people who no longer wanted crowns, but urns. In April 1931, the municipal elections became a plebiscite against the monarchy. In the big cities, the cry of republic thundered in the squares. Alfonso Tracy, aware that he no longer had the support of the bayonets nor the love of the people, decided to leave Spain and go into exile. The Second Republic was born among songs of hope and tricolor flags. It seemed that Spain was finally going to enter democratic modernity, but the road was full of mines. The 20th century was not going to give us a break. The tensions built up over decades of injustice, of bossism and bloodshed in Africa, were about to explode into the most painful conflict of our existence. Spain was rebooting, yes, but the nation's operating system was infected by a hatred that would soon take us to the abyss. That 14th of April, 1931, Spain woke up with a sun that seemed different. In the squares of Madrid, of Barcelona and Seville, thousands of people hugged each other, crying with joy while the tricolor flags fluttered in the wind. It seemed that, finally, the mud giant had managed to break its chains of centuries. The Second Republic was not born just as a change of government, it was born as a promise of light for a nation that had been in the dark for too long. The new regime arrived with an ambition never seen before. There was talk of a revolution of consciences. Thousands of schools were planned to combat the illiteracy that chained the people, and agrarian reform was initiated to give land to peasants who were dying of hunger in the large estates of the south, and an attempt was made to separate, once and for all, the hand of the church from the affairs of the state. Spain wanted to be the most advanced nation in Europe, a democracy of free and educated citizens. But beneath that surface of hope, Spain's old demons began to awaken with renewed fury. The modernity of the Republic was an insult to the elites who had dominated the country for centuries. The aristocracy, the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the high command of the army saw the reforms as a direct attack on their existence. Meanwhile, in the factories and in the fields, the patience of the dispossessed was wearing thin. For many workers and peasants, the laws of the Republic were too slow. They wanted justice now, and they wanted it by their own hands. The country began to fracture into two halves that no longer knew how to talk to each other, they only knew how to shout at each other. The years of the Republic were a carousel of instability and violence. In 1934, the Asturian Revolution turned the mining basins into a bloody battlefield, a prelude to what was to come. The repression was brutal, and hatred settled definitively in every Spanish home. It was no longer about politics, it was about ideological survival. The neighbor began to look at the neighbor suspiciously, and the words were replaced by the flash of guns in the streets. In 1936, after the Popular Front elections, the air in Spain became unbreathable. Military conspiracy was underway in the barracks, while public disorder and political assassinations became the daily norm. Spanish democracy, that beautiful dream of 1931, was disintegrating before the eyes of a world that watched with horror and fascination. On July 17, 1936, the outbreak in the Protectorate of Morocco gave the final signal. What many thought would be a quick coup d'état turned into the deepest tragedy in our history, a fratricidal civil war. Brothers against brothers, parents against children. Spain became the testing laboratory for the fascist and communist powers that would soon destroy the world in World War II. The restart of the 20th century, which began with the hope of the blast furnaces and electric light, now ended with the sound of the bombings over Madrid and the silence of the mass graves. That giant who tried to rise after the disaster of '98 had stumbled upon his own hatred. The century of technology and progress had given us, finally, the ability to destroy ourselves with terrifying efficiency. Spain was entering its longest tunnel, a tunnel of fire and darkness that would last 3 years of war and 40 years of dictatorship. I am MentorNoriegaIA, and this was the chronicle of a dream that ended in blood. The 20th century had just begun, and the price of freedom had turned out to be unbearably high.